Good evening and welcome to our winter term money webinar series by the Institute of International Monetary Research in collaboration with the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. I am Damian Pudner, Director of the IIMR, and today we are very fortunate, and I'm personally delighted, to be hosting Professor Steve Hanke. Steve is a professor of applied economics and founder and co-director of the Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health and the Study of Business Enterprise at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He is also a senior fellow at the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, a senior advisor at the Renmin University of China's International Monetary Research Institute in Beijing, and a special counselor to the Center for Financial Stability in New York. Additionally, Steve is contributing editor at Central Banking in London and a contributor at National Review. He served on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, has been a senior advisor to the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress, as well as being an advisor to 5 foreign heads of state and 5 foreign cabinet ministers. Furthermore, he played an important role in establishing new currency regimes in Argentina, Estonia, Bulgaria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Ecuador, Lithuania, and Montenegro. In 1998, he was named one of the 25 most influential people in the world by World Trade magazine and is ranked as the world's 3rd most influential economics influencer by Focus Economics in Barcelona, Spain. Professor Hanke's most recent book, which he co-authored with Jonas Herby and Lars Johang, is Did Lockdowns Work? The Verdict on COVID Restrictions, which was published by the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs in London in 2023. Today, we will discuss dollarization in Argentina, desirable and feasible. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you, Damian. Good to be with you all. Since we're talking about Argentina, let me go back and give a little historical background before we get into the particulars of dollarization. Starting in 1989 is a good place to start for me because that's when I first met Carlos Menem. He'd just been elected president in July of 1989. And for context, at that point, the hyperinflation they had, and they did have a hyperinflation, peaked out in July of 1989, the month that Menem was elected, at 197% per month. So we're talking about big time inflation then. Today, I measure inflation every day in a number of countries, including Argentina. The current inflation rate's 214% per year. So when Menem was elected, it was a lot worse. They had monthly inflation that was running then about where we are with annual inflation right now. But needless to say, 214% a year is a pretty high inflation, one of the highest in the world. So what about the meeting with Menem? Well, the meeting was actually a few months after he'd been elected. He had a lot of good ideas. He really wanted to do a Chicago Boys kind of reform in Argentina and modernization as they had just done in Chile. And he wasn't going anyplace. Nothing was happening. And no one had confidence that he was going to be able to do anything because the inflation was raging. He couldn't control inflation. So he asked what I would recommend, and I said I thought he should install a currency board. And remember, with a currency board, you issued a local currency. The peso would have been issued. It would have been backed 100% with US dollar reserves if that was a reserve currency, which would have been the logical one. And it would have traded at a freely at a fixed exchange rate. So the peso with a real currency board, an orthodox currency board, would really be a clone of the US dollar. It would be exactly the same as the US dollar. So he said, well, why don't you, write something up so we can, look at it and try to promote it and think about it. And so Kurt Schuler and I wrote a book that was published in Buenos Aires, in which we recommended a currency board that was published in 1991. And 1991 turned out to be a big year because the idea of doing something like a currency board kind of grabbed Menem's fancy. And in February of 1991, he switched Domingo Cavallo from being the foreign minister to being the economics minister. And then on April 1st, Cavallo introduced something they called a convertibility system. Many people got confused by this because they thought it was a currency board, but it wasn't. It was kind of a strange animal. It looked like a currency board, but it wasn't. It required the fixed exchange rate between the peso and the US dollar, and it also required very high reserves. But the reserves weren't fixed at between 100 and 110%, which would be the case if you had a real currency board. And as a result of the non-fixity of the cover, essentially, for most purposes, just having a minimum of 100% cover, that's what convertibility had. There were exceptions, but basically it required a minimum, but you could go up to whatever you wanted to. There was no ceiling. And as a result, that allowed the system to engage in sterilization, which they did. And they did it big time. So my reaction to that was, number one, the convertibility did smash inflation almost immediately. And almost immediately, I recommended that they actually get rid of the central bank and make the convertibility system a real currency board. I wrote that up in an article in the Wall Street Journal in October of 1991. The article was called "Argentina Should Abolish Its Central Bank and Replace It with a Real Currency Board." That didn't happen. The system lasted very well. It went through the tequila crisis. Remember, the Mexican peso collapsed in December of 1994 and sent the tequila crisis, waves of crises across Latin America in 1995. And the convertibility system did survive that in good shape and performed very well. But by the end of 1998, going into 1999, there were problems that were developing because the convertibility system allowed for discretion. It allowed for sterilization. And remember, with a currency board, the asset side of the balance sheet only has foreign exchange on it. And if it has any domestic assets, they're frozen. But the net domestic asset position in Argentina was moving all over the place. Not only foreign exchange was moving all over the place, but via sterilization, the net domestic asset position was moving all over the place, indicating discretion was taking place. And when I say moving all over the place, Chile had a managed floating exchange rate at the time, and looking from 1995 to 1999, the net domestic asset position was 6 times more volatile in Argentina than it was under the managed float in Chile, just to give you an idea of magnitudes what was going on. So at that point, 1999, Schuler and I again entered the scene and at Menem's request drafted up a dollarization law to dollarize Argentina. Unfortunately, it never happened. Eventually, the convertibility system blew up with a huge crisis in 2001. And since then, Argentina has really been in one form, one degree, I should say, of a currency and inflation crisis ever since. And that gets to the newly elected president, Javier Milei, who was elected in a little bit of a surprise in December of last year. And Milei campaigned on the idea of getting rid of the central bank, getting rid of the peso, and officially making the dollar legal tender in Argentina. That was his campaign. I think that's the main reason he won the election, because people already have unofficially dollarized. Spontaneous dollarization has occurred. Most transactions are actually done in dollars. Even if you go into small stores, often the prices are actually even listed in dollars, not in pesos. So Milei was elected in a surprise, I think, based off the idea that he could kill inflation by officially dollarizing. And at 214% a year, everyone wants inflation to be killed. So that's a very popular idea. Unfortunately, I think Milei was poorly advised, and his advisors told him they basically signed on to kind of a standard IMF type program, where instead of looking at the currency, looking at money, they looked at the budget. Typical IMF move. Let's balance the budget. Figure out how to balance the budget. That will stabilize everything, and then we'll have some of the preconditions that have to be met before you can dollarize will be out of the way, and you can go ahead and dollarize. So that's where we're at right now. Dollarization has been sidelined, put on the shelf, and Luis Caputo, who's the finance minister, economics minister, as they're called in Argentina, is basically adopted kind of this IMF type of approach. Unfortunately, a lot of the regulations and so forth that were put forward to the Congress were thrown back in the face of Milei, and he's kind of had to go back to the drawing board on this standard program that he's using. My view is that, number one, there are no contrary to what the IMF and most academic economists who have never dollarized anything in their life say, there are a lot of preconditions that have to be fulfilled before you can dollarize. Well, there aren't any preconditions that you have to fulfill. The only real precondition is that you have to have enough gross foreign reserves to be able to swap if you want to swap the paper notes and coins out into the new currency at whatever the fixed exchange rate is that you determine you're going to use. If you want to do that, you obviously have to have enough gross foreign reserves to do it. So that would, in a way, be the only precondition you'd have to meet. But the academics and IMF people have a long laundry list of preconditions, supposedly. These are nonsense. There aren't any. And I know, because I've actually dollarized Montenegro in 1999. We replaced the hyperinflating Yugoslav dinar with the Deutschmark, and no preconditions. That one was pretty easy to do because we simply, Montenegro's part of the rump Yugoslavia at that time, and we simply made the German mark legal tender along with the Yugoslav dinar, and the mark just replaced the dinar within a matter of weeks. It was already highly markized anyway. The mark was widely circulating as the dollar does in Argentina. The second one was, I didn't design it, but I was advisor to the finance minister in Ecuador in 2001 when we implemented dollarization and got rid of the sucre and replaced it with the dollar. And there were no preconditions there. We did it. And by the way, one argument in Argentina for one precondition they claim is that you have to have positive net foreign exchange reserves at the central bank. You don't. You have to have gross foreign reserves that exceed the value at the exchange rate you choose for the swap of the existing domestic currency, the peso notes and coins into US dollars. In Ecuador, we actually had negative net foreign reserves when we did it. So without getting into the academic arguments and the counting and everything, we did it and it worked and we had negative net reserves. So that's obviously blatantly not a precondition. The gross number is a precondition, and the coverage now in Argentina is about 350%. Gross reserves exceed the value at the current market exchange rate, the so-called blue rate, exceed by about 3.5 times. So I think with that, I would simply conclude that politically, I think Milei has made a mistake in terms of a sequencing. You do the big bang, you do the big currency reform, you establish stability, you get rid of inflation, you gain confidence and credibility by doing so. And stability might not be everything, but everything is nothing without stability. And then you go ahead with all these other reforms. Hopefully that will occur today. About an hour ago, my colleague Francisco Zales did meet with President Milei in Buenos Aires. I don't know the results of that meeting, but I hope Francisco made our case and put dollarization back at the front of the bus instead of being at the back of the bus. We'll see. I don't think that Milei will. I basically think he's toast unless he does dollarization. So we'll have to wait and see. Now, by the way, if you look at Montenegro, Djukanovic was the president at the time we dollarized, and what happened? He got credibility, and Montenegro became independent. They broke away from the rump Yugoslavia. That was mainly because of what we did with dollarization. That was our strategy. That was our move. That was a big bang. And that's how it works in the political dynamics of things. So at present, even though formally Montenegro is not Euroized, the euro is the currency. That's what they use in Montenegro, even though it's formally not part of the Eurozone. So it's equivalent to what Argentina would be if they formally used the dollar and became dollarized. And right now, there are about 33 countries and territories that use or that are dollarized, use a foreign currency and have no local currency. This is a policy, by the way, that's very easy to understand. If you have a basket of apples and you've got a rotten one, what do? You get rid of the bad apple. If you have a currency that's the equivalent of a bad apple and keeps giving you trouble over and over and over again, over 100 years, as is the case in Argentina, what do? You get rid of the peso. And you get rid of the central bank, because, by the way, if you don't, you have a potential problem, because a central bank setting off there, even if it's not issuing a currency, it's like setting a bottle of whiskey in front of a recovering alcoholic. That alky, he'll grab for it. So that's why in 1981, as early as 1981, I was arguing that they should get rid of the BCRA, the central bank in Argentina. Get rid of it. And then by the time 1999 came around, I concluded, well, the peso under convertibility wasn't a perfect clone of the US dollar, because the BCRA existed and they had discretionary monetary policy and they used it. Most economists don't understand this. Kurt Schuler did a study of the 100 top economists in the world and whether they used correctly and could correctly identify and differentiate between what a currency board is and what convertibility was. He found that only 7%, 7 out of 100 were identifying convertibility as a central bank with a fixed exchange rate, a pegged exchange rate, that did engage in discretionary monetary policy. 93 out of 100, 93% said it was a currency board, but they don't realize it. A currency board, you just have to look at the balance sheet. The balance sheet on the asset side has one thing that moves: net foreign assets. If it has domestic assets, they're frozen. And in some cases, they simply don't exist. I mean, Hong Kong is a currency board, and they don't have any domestic assets on their balance sheet. And again, the places where they have currency boards, they have a floor on the foreign exchange reserves 100% and a ceiling of about 110, maybe 115%. You have to have a floor and a ceiling on the foreign reserves. Otherwise, the monetary authority can engage in sterilization and discretion. So with that, Damian, I think we should open the floor for a discussion.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for an intriguing and detailed presentation there on a very topical subject, and one that's not just important for Argentina, but indeed any country that's suffering from extremely high levels of inflation. I do have a few questions. You've mentioned already the appointment of Luis Caputo as finance minister. Many people have been surprised by that appointment. He's been outspoken in the past against dollarization. Do you think that dollarization is now off the table for Argentina?
Well, at least temporarily it is. Right now, Milei is receiving a lot of pressure from his supporters who actually are dollarizers. They want to dollarize. So he's receiving a big pushback from them. So he's verbally, rhetorically, he's talking the talk. But he's not walking the walk, because Caputo is a finance minister. He has a lot of power, and he's not a dollarizer. And it looks like the program he's putting in place is a pretty plain vanilla IMF kind of program that doesn't include a currency reform. I think, reading between, the one reason that I mentioned Menem in there and gave that historical background, look what Menem did. Once he figured out he wasn't going anyplace, what did he do? He brought Cavallo, he pulled him off of being foreign minister and made him economics minister, point number one. So he changed the economic minister and the portfolio. What did he do? He said, do something like this currency board thing that Hanke and Schuler are talking about. It turned out they didn't do exactly an orthodox currency board. They did something similar, called it convertibility, but it did the job. Initially, it did the job. I predicted in the Wall Street Journal in October of 1991 that eventually it would collapse, because the central bank had discretionary power and they would be tempted and they would ultimately use it. That ultimately happened, but it took 10 years. They had 10 really good years in Argentina under convertibility. Most people miss that. Most economists just focus on the collapse. They forget what inflation was. They were hyperinflating when it started, April 1, 1991. It killed that immediately. And they had 10 terrific years under convertibility. Yeah. And by the way, most of what you read in the press is just utter rubbish about all these preconditions. It's Hanke's 95% rule. 95% of what you read in the press is either wrong or irrelevant. And most of these people, I just saw J.P. Morgan, one of the analysts, who they know nothing about these currency reforms. None of these people are interviewing have ever done a currency reform. I must say, in your introduction, you got me right. I've done a pretty good handful of them. So I'm not talking in a classroom here, Damian. I'm a real world kind of guy. I've done these. I know how to do them. They've all worked, and I can assure you, all these preconditions that are listed by investment bankers, academics, journalists, and you name it, are total rubbish.
Well, this leads on to another question that's come up. Is dollarization in Argentina unconstitutional? I guess,
as far as I know, no.
I think this might relate to the requirement of a federal bank with the power to issue a currency in the charter.
But that's a minor thing. They're dollarized and have been for 100 years in Panama, and they have a central bank, and they issue a Balboa. It's equal to $1. It's a coin.
Right.
So
right.
This is a kind of a non-issue, basically. So you just have you have something you call a national authority, a national monetary authority, whatever you want to call it, and it issues a coin that's equal to $1. You call it a Buenos Aires or something.
Okay, and I mean, a number of people in the Q&A are mentioning that a currency board would be a much better solution and receive more support. Do you agree with that? I mean, also, I guess there's a presidential election coming up in 2027, which whatever decision they go with, dollarization, currency board, something else, they still have to get that in place by 2027.
Well, I don't, and that's from experience being there. I saw how the convertibility worked. You have to realize that in Argentina, especially after Perón in 1945, enemy is pervasive. Whatever the law is in Argentina, they just don't follow it.
Right.
So even if you had a currency board, my guess is they would figure a way to some loophole, figure out some way to get around it. So the easiest way is just to forget it. Instead of trying to clone the dollar with a currency board, you just go to the real deal. Forget a law that maybe they'll follow, maybe they won't. And so that's why we went down this path. Remember, 1989, Schuler and I meet Menem, write our book, published in 1991. They did convertibility. We know the story there. And by 99, there were problems developing. And that's when Menem requested a draft dollarization law. He said, why bother with trying our best to clone the dollar? Why not just do the real deal?
Agree.
The only advantage, by the way, in a currency board is that you would get seniorage, because the liabilities that you issue, the local money, don't cost you anything, essentially cost you nothing, and don't pay interest. But the assets, the 100% to 110% reserve cover that you have, those are invested in US dollar assets, and they earn interest. So you automatically make a profit. The currency boards always make a profit. So you would lose that little bit of seniorage. But I think in the Argentine case, the enemy problem is the enemy of any kind of legal institution in Argentina.
Right. A quick question on the shuttering of the central bank, if that was to actually go through. Who becomes the lender of last resort, and who will be responsible for bank instability?
Oh, well, that's easy to do because you get integrated with the international capital markets, and you do just what they do in Panama. The banking system, they've got an onshore and offshore banking system in Panama, and it's like there's a huge ocean of dollar liquidity out there, and Panama is a little pond connected with a canal, literally, to the ocean. And given the arbitrage that develops between the ocean and the pond, you automatically, if you have a liquidity problem, not a solvency problem, but a liquidity problem, that never occurs because you got the ocean out there. And what happens is the interest rates go up in Panama, and it just sucks liquidity into the system.
Right.
So you just let the private market handle the thing.
Right.
That would be the best way to make certain that the banking system was fully integrated and connected with the ocean of worldwide dollar liquidity. Now, if for some reason it wasn't, theoretically, I'm not advocating this. You could have the fiscal authorities operate as a lender of last resort, and have a bag-up type rule. Again, in Argentina, they probably wouldn't follow it. That's why I'd like the market to handle it rather than any public institution. But if you had the fiscal authorities handling it because you didn't have a central bank, the rule would be, yes, the fiscal authorities would lend to a solvent financial institution, but only at penalty rates. The problem in Argentina, that would never happen.
Right.
There would be no penalty rates. They would probably give the money to them.
So what do you think is the price of delaying dollarization here? I mean, how long has Milei got to make the decision, in your view?
I think the clock's ticking on Milei. I really think his credibility and confidence in him to get things done is deteriorating over time. I don't know how fast that rate of deterioration is, but it's clearly deteriorating. And as inflation continues to roar away, and it will continue, by the way, for a long time, because there's a lag between changes in the money supply and changes in inflation. And in the run-up to the election, the Peronistas goosed the money supply tremendously. It was growing in December, it was growing over 100% year over year. So there's a lot of juice in the system.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. We have one coming in here. How do you believe dollarization would impact Argentina's fiscal autonomy and its ability to manage economic shocks and debt levels in the long term? This is a reference to its, economic instability and the reliance on the IMF in the past.
Okay, well, this is this is fairly easy to do. This is kind of an academic question in a way, because if they have their own currency, they have one currency crisis after another, one fiscal crisis after another. They've defaulted on their debt more than any major country recently. Just one crisis, debt crisis, currency crisis, inflation crisis, you name it. The crisis is caused by the peso. So you get rid of the peso and you get rid of the crises. That's how you manage it. And the key here is the same with an orthodox currency board or dollarization. You put a hard budget constraint in the fiscal system and in the monetary system. So you put the fiscal authorities in somewhat of a straitjacket. They don't have much of a choice. They can't go to a monetary authority and obtain credit. It's not in the game. It's over. So as a result, even in a place like Bulgaria, where I put in a currency board in 1997, it's working beautifully. They've had all kinds of governments. So they've had socialist governments, they've had middle of the road, right wing, and so forth. So they always more or less balance the budget because they don't really have a choice, the fiscal authorities, and that's why Bulgaria has the second lowest debt to GDP ratio of any country in the EU. Bulgaria is a member of the EU, but it's not a member of the Eurozone. They have a currency board. They have the Bulgarian lev as a currency. It's a clone of the euro. And the debt to GDP ratio is under 25%. Estonia, which did have a currency board, which I helped install in 1992, they eventually switched to the euro in Estonia. They have the lowest debt to GDP ratio. So it's all about putting us, you've got to look at monetary institutions in a different way. The key is to look at them as means to put a straitjacket and a hard budget constraint on fiscal authorities. That's the most important part of a currency board or a dollarized system. It's to control the fisc. That is the key to the whole thing. Now, most monetary economists have no idea about this, by the way. They're in a classroom talking whatever rubbish they're talking that has no connection to the real world. The real world is one of taking a monetary authority and defanging it and removing its ability to extend credit to the fiscal authorities. That is the key to the whole thing when you get into this debt business.
Steve, you make a very compelling argument for dollarization in Argentina. I know you're a very busy person. We're going to end it there, but I do thank you for being with us today. And as always, I've really enjoyed your presentation. And I'll call it a night. Thank you very much.